All right, we're going to begin our course in 17th century literature with not a study of poetry, which will be the primary object of study on the course, but with something else that is characteristic of the period, namely its rationalism. And that is best exemplified in the work of the author that we're going to look at today, namely Francis Bacon. And in particular, I'm not going to look at his Novum Organum or in his other Novum Organum, rather, or of his other prose works, but rather of his famous essays. Now, these essays, to which Bacon has been credited with discovering, are probably more likely to be attributed to a French author by the name of Michel de Montaigne. And Bacon, with his vast erudition, had read Montaigne, probably in the original language, and decided that this was a form that he also wanted to adopt for his own. Now, one of the things that's extraordinary about the essay is that it is a novel form. It is not a form that is used by the ancients at all. It's not a form that we find in the Renaissance. Unlike the sonnet, which was discovered in the Renaissance, there are no essays written in the Renaissance. Rather, it is a form which we can see is characteristic of the modern scientific age. Now, the Royal Society of Science that really we associate with the foundation of modern science, 1662, I believe. We might have the year slightly off. We associate that with the scientific method, but we can see the beginnings of that and really the methodology of the scientific method with Francis Bacon and his method of inductive reasoning. I will say a little bit more about that in a second, but let me go back to the word essay before I forget. Essay comes from the French word essayer, which is to try. And what we are getting here in the form of the essay is a trial, a sort of trial balloon for an idea. Montaigne, who is a delightful writer that I encourage you to read as well, uses this form to advance various types of ideas, and he does so in an extended form. These are not your modern opinion columns. It's nothing like an opinion. It is an exploration of an idea that begins, as the inductive method suggests, with a particular idea, and from that it tries to make broader conclusions from that. And throughout, we can see that there is a definite belief on the authors writing these essays that there is truth and it can be known. And in their essay, they are going to, from the beginning of a small shard of truth, try to draw together a composite picture of what truth is like, and in the ways in which it is seemingly contradicted, but not, and the way in which it can be presented in a more fulsome fashion. So these are rather delightful, and I find Bacon's own essays to be particularly well written. And we're going to begin with his essay, rather appropriately, of truth. Now, in this essay, Bacon has presented truth in various manifestations. He does talk about the subjective side of it. He does talk about the way truth relates to falsehood, and the way in which we see that human beings are not necessarily willing to accept the truth. In fact, they seem to rather love lies, and he will speak about that as well. And so he begins with a very interesting little quotation, and this is typical of Bacon. Again, I said a man of vast erudition, like many in the Renaissance, with a quotation from Pontius Pilate, the governor, who asked the question, "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. So begins Bacon's essay. Now, what I'd like to draw to your attention about Bacon's essay is that it is not written in paragraphs, and it does not contain what students are told they ought to put in their essays, namely a topic sentence, which is the sentence that distills the proof in the paragraph, proving the thesis. and drawing a connection through paragraphs, we'll see that Bacon does not use that form of organizing his thoughts. Rather, he uses what in classical rhetoric is called the period. And it is the manner in which New Testament scriptures are written, by the way. It is a very often quite lengthy thought, which is organized in terms of parallelisms and antitheses in the same way that biblical poetry functions. So also does the classical mind in drawing analogies between things. And as I say, there can be comparisons, there can be parallels, there can be antitheses, there can be flat contradictions, and they are all contained in the same thought unit. It's often said of intelligent people that they think in paragraphs and not merely in individual thoughts, let alone sentences. The classical mind thinks more broadly still, and it's encouraged to do so by the education that they receive in classical rhetoric, which will be built on this very idea of the classical period. Now, when we use the word period, in England, they call it the full stop. We think of a punctuation point. They are not talking about that. They are talking about an organization of thought. That's how Bacon is writing here. Again, in modern essay forms, you are, as I say, encouraged to have topic, sentences, and paragraphs organizing them. That's not what we will see with Bacon. Bacon will begin with an introduction. I just mentioned what the introduction was, a reference to Pontius Pilate. And quite extraordinarily, he's asking what truth is. And the irony for the reader is that we know that Jesus is the truth, because this has already been announced in John's gospel. He's standing in the presence of capital T truth, the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. That's how he begins this essay. So he begins with an introduction. He pulls us in. Note how pithy and concise and how appropriate the example is. And this is key to writing a good essay, is catching the reader right away. So there's an introduction, there's a statement of the case before us, there's an outline of the argument, then there are proofs offers, there are refutations of various positions that are contrary to the author's essay, and then finally there'll be a conclusion. Now, these are parts of the essay. They're not necessarily paragraphs. You don't have an introductory paragraph, a statement of the case that you're going to make as the paragraph, an outline as a paragraph, etc. These are interwoven. These are simply 6 parts. We can see them all, as I say, all around the essay. But the essay, in this case, is on truth. Let me say one further thing by way of introduction, and that is that Bacon is not only responding to Michel de Montaigne, he is also responding to the cosmological shift that I spoke to previously, and the way in which it challenged the existing body of knowledge. And I think there's much to be said about the influence of the cosmological shift, but there's another influence in the period, which I think is rather important, and I have not yet mentioned, which is the incursion of skepticism into the European mindset in this period, which came along with the rediscovery of the works of Sextus Empiricus, who is a skeptical philosopher. And his works were wildly popular and influential. And at the same time, when there was a, as I say, with the inductive method of Bacon, an emphasis on using the senses and then making general conclusions from that small beginning, making broader conclusions, as opposed to the deductive methods of looking at the macrocosm and then coming down to the microcosm. By the way, in Aristotle, both forms of proof are presented. In the modern way of looking at things, whether you're looking at the empiricists, like Bacon, but also we'll associate them with Locke and Hume and Berkeley. If you're in the analytic tradition of philosophy, you'll know what I'm talking about here. But even in the rationalists, coming out from the other vantage point, there's a certain necessity placed on using your senses. But Sextus Empiricus, the skeptic, is skeptical precisely about the senses. So we note 2 things concurrent. On the one hand, an an attention to the senses and what one can demonstrate and prove with the senses. And the scientific method will arise out of that, trial and error, right? And testing and verifying with your own eyes by means of an experiment that somebody else can repeat. But at the same time, there's a philosophy that is introduced that becomes wildly popular that tells us that we cannot trust our senses. And so we will get philosophers ranging from Locke, but certainly there in David Hume, that will insist that not only can we not trust our senses to make causational statements, notions of cause and effect and so forth, but also that we cannot talk about things like objective morality, the existence of God, et cetera, et cetera. So these two things emerge at the same time. There is a scientific discovery in the realm of astronomy, which does throw into doubt not only the astronomy, but the implicated sciences, whether they are actually in the realm of number or of word, but also throws into popularity, shall we say, the idea of being skeptical of premises and not trusting what others have said. So the motto of the Royal Society is to nullium in verba, trust no one's word. You are to test it with your own senses, but the senses that are giving you the means of verification, you're also skeptical about. And so there's this, as I say, this tension there that is seeking after truth and at the same time not going to be satisfied with the truth that one has received as truth, even through the experiment. And thus the experiment needs to continue on. And thus we see the beginnings of the scientific method and the idea of the progress of science. But Bacon, note in his essay and with his opening gambit, what is truth, suggesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer, Bacon goes on to explore the reasons why the people do not like the truth, Pilate being the most famous example. And he gives a few discrete reasons. First of all, truth is acquired through hard work. And we're reluctant to work hard. This is one of the reasons that Augustine says that some passages in scripture, the essence of Christian teaching is very easy to grasp, but there are many things in scripture which are hard for us to understand, and we have to work at them. And Augustine explains that God puts them there explicitly and intentionally so that we would wrestle and we would get the delight of understanding things that were hard for us at first, so we can make progress in our understanding of the faith. But Bacon suggests that it's partly related to laziness. Secondly, and this is important and interesting, he says that the truth curtails human freedom. And this seems to be more significant for him. He says, rather than simply disliking the truth, we are attached to lies. He says, he calls it a natural, though corrupt love of the lie itself. And when he does this, of course, he echoes scripture in reference to those that oppose Jesus Christ. The reason why they would not receive him is because not only that they didn't know who he was, but they actually loved the falsehoods because the falsehoods flattered them. And of course, the falsehoods were an implication of the work of the one who was the father of all lies, namely the devil. Bacon says that we love falsehood because that truth is as if the bright light of the day would show what men in actuality are, and we don't want to see it. As they say in pop culture, we can't handle the truth. Plato uses the allegory of the cave to illustrate the very same thing. And what we love, namely the lies, look attractive and colorful in the dim light of lies. And he adds further to that point and says that a mixture of lie doth ever add pleasure. So we delight in intermingling truth and falsehood. What you'll note in this already is that Bacon is a very subtle thinker. He shifts around and considers things from various vantage points, and he does so not in paragraphs, but again in single lines even. He's moving around as he's walking and he's talking, and he does so in a way that is profound, I find. But it's the fact that we prefer to cherish illusions, which make life more interesting, he says. There's an element in which falsehood, for all of Plato's aversion to it, is something that we not only love, but to some degree cherish. And so he's making a psychological observation, as well as a spiritual observation, that if deprived, he says, of false pride and vanities, the human mind would contract like a deflated balloon, and people would become poor and sad and ill. So he ascribes some good to falsehood then, not merely because it acts as a contrast to the truth, but to some degree, he's even giving it a little bit of praise, which is a rather extraordinary thing. Most writers are not going to do that. And of course, as I said, Plato himself is not going to agree with according any significance or goodness to lies. But Bacon says, probably thinking of Plato, that poetic untruth is a wine of the devil in the priest's eyes, but is not harmful as the other lies are. So now he's talking not about theological lies. He's talking about poetic untruth. So in less significant realms than that of theological dogma, there are some lies which are delightful and yet not nearly as harmful. And Bacon, being an artist, illustrates this, saying that poetic untruth is not really a lie, it's a shadow of a lie. And again, a subtle reference to Plato and his allegory of the cave. So it's not that poetic untruth is a lie, which is Plato's assertion, it's the shadow of a lie. And the inquiry of truth and the knowledge of truth and the belief of truth, these three things are compared with the enjoyment that comes from love. And his comparison lends a literary charm that he says in the last act of creation was to create the rational faculty in mankind. Remember, God on the sixth day created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. When it says in the image of God he created them, in what sense is God or is man made in God's image? It's not in a physical sense. Remember, mankind has been made out of the dust, out of the clay. The overwhelming opinion of the Christian tradition, which Bacon will articulate and will also utter, is that we have a rational mind, that capacity for reasoning, which allows us our mind to ascend upward and think along the lines of the great chain of being that I spoke about in the previous lecture. And this rational faculty helps in finding truth, which is the finished product itself of God's blessing. As Bacon says, the last was the light of reason, which is the illumination of his, namely God's Spirit. So what we can see here is that Bacon, for all of his reference to the understanding of the day, because at the outset here, he actually does make reference to the skeptical writers of the day, and their assertion that knowledge is impossible, sounding a lot like Pilate. So Bacon is implicitly making a comment about the skeptics in his day and why they are skeptical. He's casting aspersions on their motives. He is making a deeply theological statement here as well, which is probably appropriate for an essay of truth. Now, as far as that passage I referred to of man being made in God's image, it follows with the commandment mankind is being given. Remember, I talked about the Genesis 1 being can be broken down in terms of the supernatural fact of creation, the supernatural act of creation, and the supernatural pact of creation. Well, the supernatural pact is the commandment given by God to mankind to be fruitful and multiply and fill and subdue the earth and to bring it under his dominion. That command can only be affected if paradise in which mankind has been placed is broadened out. And that, Bacon asserts, can only happen with the help of truth, with his rational faculty. And so dominion will come in concord with the faculty of reasoning. And so mankind in the 17th century is seen as the first scientist. if we were looking at Milton's Paradise Lost, which I'm not going to do on this course for reasons I said already, I deal with it on another course specifically dedicated to John Milton, we would find that Adam and Eve, both of them, are really like scientists. They seem to understand things and understand them even in their causes. And they're intensely interested in learning more. They ask questions of the angels about things that is not immediately apparent to them, and have scientific discourse between them, between the angels and man, and between Adam and Eve themselves. So this isn't just moral idealism, it is the way in which truth is a part of the Dominion mandate. And with this, we can see the beginnings of the foundation for an apologetic for Christian education. That is what we are to do. We're bringing about or restoring the ruins of our first parents, to use Milton's phrase there. And Bacon insists that we should stick to the truth in every matter. We should do an act of charity and have faith in every matter. And we should have faith in God in that. And he puts it this way: certainty, it is heaven upon earth to have a man's mind move in charity, rest in providence, and turn upon the poles of truth. From this opening gambit, which takes place over several lines here, and the objective truth, he moves from that to the subjective truth, which he calls the truth of civil business. Now, I talked about in the, when I gave my opening lecture, and I talked about the great chain of being, and I talked about correspondences, I talked about the microcosm and the macrocosm, and how we could see this at the realm of nature, between the heavens and the correspondence between that and the earth, and the correspondence between the king and the subject, and the correspondence between the reason and the passions. These faculties were involved in a chain of correspondences, and they were exact correspondences. Same way the music could be seen at three levels and so forth. Bacon moves to that now to the civic realm, so the middle realm, if you will, which he calls the truth of civil business. So more subjective, less eternal and unquestionable, the way objective truth is, the way theological truth is. He says that this truth is compelling, and he says its compelling quality is acknowledged even by those that don't practice truth. They understand and they appeal to fairness and so forth, among other things. And he says that clear and round dealing is the honor of man's nature, and that mixture of falsehood is like alloy in coin of gold and silver, which make the metal work better, but embaseth it. He's thinking of it, and now note the aptness of his analogy here. He's talking about debasing currency. Rather than using pure gold, which is worth more, we mix it with, alloy it with other metals. Now that makes it more permanent. So if you use pure gold, it's so malleable that you can squish it, and it doesn't last very long. So you add base metals to it, and of course that allows you to use it as currency without it breaking down. However, in the process, it loses its value. Now you can see the application here to the civic sphere. And he's talking in some ways about the relation of theology to things like politics and civic life, where we find an intermixture or a mixture of truth and lies. So that's his application. And isn't it a memorable one of the way in which truth and falsehood are mixed in this world? But he goes on, he's quite on the side of the truth here. He says that liars are like a snake that goes upon its belly and not upon its feet. And he gives imagery which make this comparison rather convincing. And he does refer to Montaigne here, who is of the view that, quote, a lie faces God and shrinks from man. Montaigne says this. I think you could find that Erasmus said something very similar to this. And that brings to mind, I mentioned skepticism, and I do want to draw to your attention a work by a writer by the name of Richard Popkin. I came upon this work many, many years ago as an undergraduate when I was doing a history of thought type course, intellectual history, the history of skepticism. Now, when I read it, it was from Erasmus to Spinoza. I note that in later editions, he has extended the scope, and it now begins from Savonarola to Bayle. Now, Savonarola was an Italian priest, famous for the bonfire of the vanities in Florence, the burning of non-Christian knowledge. He was a reformer. Very interesting. So he associates the influence of skeptical philosophy on Savonarola's project of burning non-truthful matter. Just draw that to your attention. You might find it interesting. Again, Richard Popkin is his name. The History of Skepticism from Savonarola to Pierre Bayle. Well worth your attention. But back to Bacon. Bacon says that, or refers to Montaigne, and he says that a lie faces God and shrinks from man. And then I thought about Erasmus, who said something like that. So a man who is a liar fears man and does not fear God. That's the problem. He is fearful of something, but he's fearful of the thing he ought to be less fearful of then, rather than more fearful. And this is the problem. And Bacon adds to that point by saying that falsehood is the height of wickedness, and as such will invite God's judgment on the doomsday. And so he begins, and once again, as from the beginning, is connecting all of his thoughts with Christian truth. But there's no digressions here. The arguments that are made are on one point and one alone. And we can see the breadth of Bacon's learning, referring first of all to Pontius Pilate, so a historical figure, central to the Christian story, of course, confronting the man who is truth himself. He makes reference to Lucian, who's a Greek author, very witty, who disputed the Greek gods. He refers to Genesis 1, the creation narrative. He refers to Michel de Montaigne, and he makes all manner of analogies and similes through there. And he draws those from historical allusions. So what he does in this is he shows that truth is an open day light. And it is the thing that we ought to move towards. And in this, he echoes Plato and the rational tradition. Whereas he says a lie, he doesn't call it darkness. The analogy he provides is it's like candlelight. Because that's what's appealing to it. And even Socrates says this in Plato's works. The reason why people do wicked things is they perceive some good in it. There is a light they see. What they do is they misapprehend the lesser light for the greater light. So truth is, as Bacon puts it, a pearl, worthy and precious. Of course, he's using the analogy that Jesus himself does in his parable. Whereas the falsehood is like a diamond. It reflects light in an illusory fashion, but only in the presence of daylight. And so we need to place it in, if you go into a jewelry store, it's placed against a black cloth, the backdrop, and then light is on it. So it looks brilliant. But of course, diamonds don't actually shine without the presence of truth. So this is not an ornamental piece of writing. It is simple, it's straightforward, it's to the point, and it is trying to explore and dig down on what truth is. We notice, again, the classical form, but we also note an economy of phrasing, syntactic brevity, rhetorical flourishes all around this. I have not given sufficient attention to that, but that's a good beginning for our study of Bacon's essays. Thank you.